I've often wondered, in quiet evenings, why I'm so drawn to these big questions about good and evil, light and darkness, order and chaos. Perhaps because, like anyone else, I've been through moments when everything seemed meaningless. And that's when I began searching for answers. Not necessarily in scholarly books, but in the way life moves around me. I gradually discovered that things aren't that simple, that there's not only black and white, that we're not just victims of a capricious universe, and above all, that what we call evil isn't always a pure enemy here to destroy us, but sometimes a strange teacher forcing us to look into places we'd never have dared on our own. The truth is, I am neither a philosopher nor some great spiritual seeker. I'm just a curious person trying to understand why life is the way it is. And if my thoughts resonate with you, then maybe it's no coincidence we've found each other here, even if only for a few minutes. The beginning, about the tree of knowledge and the role of the serpent. I've often asked myself why, in so many old stories, there's always this seemingly trivial prohibition. Do not eat from that fruit. And yet it's precisely this prohibition that seems to ignite an irresistible spark. Maybe humans simply can't stand the thought that there's something hidden from them, something they're not supposed to know. And so we bite into the forbidden fruit, not necessarily out of pure rebellion, but from a deep, almost painful curiosity. When I look at how we react afterwards, I see a strange dance of blame unfolding. The first person points a finger at someone else, that one at a third, and so on, until all eyes turn to the one who remains silent. A kind of silent serpent who no longer needs to say anything because he's understood long ago how desire and temptation work. Who sits at God's right hand and who on the left? I grew up with the idea that on the right side of the divine throne sits light, forgiveness, the safe side of existence. But I was always intrigued who sits on the left. I found out bit by bit that this is where the accuser sits, the one who questions, the one who exposes the cracks in our souls. So it's not necessarily an enemy, but more like a cosmic prosecutor, checking whether what we claim to be actually holds true. It's fascinating how almost no one sympathizes with the accuser. Instinctively, we all side with the defense, with the one who makes us feel safe. Or maybe because deep down we know that one day we might be called before such a court ourselves. And who would want to be judged harshly? If God were the author of evil. Many times I've been shaken by the thought that if there were an absolute author of evil, we'd all be mere helpless victims, just pawns in some macabre game. But something inside me rejects this scenario. I feel that things aren't that cruel. Maybe what we call God isn't some separate self pulling strings at his whim. Maybe we're not victims of a foreign will, but parts of a whole, participating in our own experiences. In moments of clarity, I realize I am responsible. That if I choose to stay wrapped in an illusion, it's my choice. But there's always the possibility to wake up. And that changes everything. I'm no longer a passive being, but an actor in my own story. Demons and facing fear. In Buddhist texts, I found something that completely changed my view of evil. There, demons aren't described as purely malicious entities. They may appear frightening, but they don't come to destroy us. They come to challenge us. They are messengers of change, of impermanence, of the truth, that nothing stays the same. And yes, fear is the first natural reflex. But if instead of running from these shadows, I choose to face them, something happens. Their mask begins to fall away. What once seemed like a monster, ready to swallow me, turns into an unusual teacher.
showing me how death gives shape to life, how endings make beginnings possible. Job and Satan as prosecutor.
I like to recall the story of Job precisely because it's so full of paradoxes. There, Satan isn't painted as heaven's enemy, but more like a strict inspector, a prosecutor sent to test the authenticity of man.
He doesn't come to destroy Job out of malice, but to test him. And God accepts this test as if knowing Job holds a strength that needs to be brought to light. Job endures suffering, but in the end remains dignified, and the prosecutor loses his case. What strikes me is that although this accuser serves order, rarely does anyone feel compassion for him. All our sympathy goes to the defense, to the one fighting to remain pure.
Our sympathy for the defense.
Maybe we have a natural tendency to side with the one being judged.
We feel a connection to the tried soul, perhaps because each of us faces our own inner trials.
We know what it's like to be scrutinized, to be questioned, even if not by a cosmic court, then by our own conscience. That's why when Job proves his strength, we feel a deep joy.
It nourishes the hope that we too might face our own trials with dignity. And maybe the role of the accuser, of the demon, isn't to tear us down, but to strengthen us, to bring forth what was already there, just hidden.
Christ and Satan, roles in a cosmic play. I've come to see this whole picture as a vast play where roles were assigned long before the curtain rose.
We have a defender and an accuser, but perhaps neither plays against the other.
Maybe both work for the same justice, the same balance. It's strange to think that before the curtain lifted, everything had already been arranged backstage, challenges accepted, trials planned, and their full purpose only revealed at the end.
And maybe even then we don't understand it all, but we feel a kind of peace, as if this whole game had meaning from the very start.
Childhood lessons and the black and white game.
When I look back at my childhood, I realize some lessons weren't taught to me directly, but I learned them anyway. On my mother's lap, or simply by watching the world. I learned to count, to link letters into words, but much more subtly, I learned to see the world in contrasts, black and white, good and bad, allowed and forbidden.
No one explicitly taught me this polarity. It slipped naturally into my mind through stories, through adults' reactions, through their surprised or frowning faces. That's how I came to believe life is a battlefield of opposing forces, endlessly trying to annihilate each other.
Only later did I begin to suspect it might not be so, that perhaps we don't live in confrontation, but in a relationship of coexistence.
The magnet and the impossibility of separating its poles.
I once heard a simple but revealing image. Try to cut off the south pole of a magnet and see what you get. You won't end up with a single north pole, but with two smaller magnets, each having its own north and south.
It's impossible to completely separate opposites.
It's the same within me.
I can't extract fear entirely and leave only courage.
I can't tear out sadness, hoping to keep a pure, uninterrupted joy. These things come together. They define each other.
That's how I understand that good and evil, light and shadow, aren't enemies, but partners in a continuous dance. Each brings the other into view.
If I had never felt pain, how could I recognize relief?
If there were no endings, how could I ever cherish beginnings? The polarity of perception and of visual paradox. I remembered that famous image, two black faces in profile, nearly touching, which at the same time form a white chalice in the space between them. When I look closely, I can see either the faces or the chalice.
But I can't see both at the same time, even though both are always there. To me, this reveals a subtle truth about how my perception works. I always choose, often without realizing it, which shape to focus on. And so I build a fragmented reality while the whole remains unchanged in the background.
Perhaps I do the same with life. I choose to see either joy or pain, either hope or despair. But all of them are there together, forming a complete picture that I can rarely embrace in a single glance. How I choose what to see.
I've learned that in Sanskrit, there's the word avidya, meaning not seeing, or more precisely, ignoring something. Not because I'd be ignorant in the sense of stupidity, but because my attention is selective. I look at the chalice and ignore the faces, or I look at the faces and ignore the chalice.
It's the same when I define good and evil in my life. I create narrow concepts, little boxes where I place events and people saying, this is good, this is bad.
But I forget that full reality holds them all. The void doesn't exclude form. Form doesn't exclude the empty space.
Many times I believe I'm just the one who sees, who knows, who understands.
But if there were nothing to be seen, what use would the observer have? Subject and object are as interdependent as the inside and outside of a circle. You can't have one without the other. The void as interdependence.
Little by little, I'm beginning to understand that what seems empty is not meaningless at all. On the contrary, this emptiness is precisely the relationship that connects everything. In Buddhism, they speak of shunyata, the emptiness of things from their own separate existence. A cup exists only because the space around it makes it visible. A sound exists only because silence surrounds it. And so do I. I exist because others exist.
My joy is shaped by the memory of sadness. Order is possible only because of the latent chaos from which it arose. And it's not just a comforting idea.
It's a law of how things are. When I look at the yin and yang diagram, I see two fish endlessly chasing each other, transforming one into the other.
They're not fighting, they're flowing together. Yin and yang, or the dance of the fish.
When I truly look at the symbol of yin and yang, I no longer see a struggle between black and white. I see a dance. The two fish swirl into each other, chase one another, merge and recreate without end. And I wonder, is one really trying to devour the other?
If the white were to truly win and erase the black completely, it would destroy itself.
Because it can exist only in relation to its opposite. Life itself isn't a brutal clash of opposites, but a spiral where they shape each other. Instead of being adversaries, they are co-authors of the same living painting. I wonder what would happen if the white fish, symbol of order and light, were to completely dominate.
It would erase the black, chaotic, unpredictable one. But then it would have no space left to exist. Because white, without black, has no background on which to shine.
That's why I'm starting to accept that I can't live only in pure light, without shadows.
That the joy I feel in moments of peace exists precisely because somewhere, sometime I've felt restlessness and longing.
Life is a dance, not a fight.
Instead of seeing the world as a battlefield where good must defeat evil, I'm starting to see it as a dance. A game of contrasts that define each other. Pain, loss, all that I once called bad, is part of the same show that gives rise to love, beauty, laughter.
It's not a cheap consolation.
It's the very structure of reality.
If I look closely, I see how each aspect has its place in the vast tapestry of existence.
Then life no longer feels like a competition I have to win.
It becomes an invitation to dance, to take part in something bigger than myself.
the game and the role of evil.
I also notice how, in my own relationships, I need some kind of contrast to define myself. Every group I've identified with, friends, family, circles of good people, has always had some other group seen as negative. Without this contrast, our identity would be much more fragile. Paradoxically, my enemies have helped me understand who I am. They've kept the game tense, sharpened my attention, questioned my certainties.
I'm not saying I should accept injustice or cruelty, but I can see that in the full picture of life, these adversaries appear like mirrors.
And maybe what is called loving your enemy isn't sentimental advice, but an act of lucidity, recognizing that they too are a necessary part of the game. In the end, not victory, but a perpetual play.
All this leads me to a simple conclusion, but one incredibly liberating.
Life is not a war meant to be won.
It's a play, a spiral in which good and evil, light and shadow, order and chaos spin without end.
Not to establish a winner, but to define each other, to create the contrast from which shapes are born. And so when I look at the symbol of the two fish, I no longer see a tragic scene.
I see two children running in a circle, laughing, holding hands.
They pass the baton back and forth, and in their race they weave together the story of life. Maybe in the end, true wisdom isn't to make evil disappear, but to learn to dance with it, with respect, with care, with an open heart. And in the background, the music goes on, no matter how grave or joyful I choose to hear it.
Thank you for listening.
If you'd like to support me, you can subscribe to the channel. Until next time, I hope you too will find your own way.